Pope Francis is gone, but his light still walks with us. He never asked for power, but somehow, through quiet gestures and small steps, he shifted the soul of the Church and perhaps the world. He didn't try to be holy. He simply chose to be fully human. And in a time when humanity feels fractured, that became his greatest offering. Pope Francis is gone, but the silence he lived and the silence he left behind still speaks maybe even louder than words ever could. A whisper from the heart. On the 21st of April, 2025, just one day after Easter Sunday, Pope Francis passed away. And with his passing, something in the world paused. It wasn't just the Church that mourned. It was the poor, the forgotten, the silent ones, the seekers, the doubters, the peacemakers, the wounded, and anyone who had once hoped that kindness might still have power. Because Pope Francis wasn't just a religious figure. He was a spiritual presence, someone who reminded us, not with sermons, but with actions, that humility can be louder than pride, that gentleness can be stronger than control, and that love, when walked with conviction, can change everything. He didn't live to impress the powerful. He lived to accompany the weak. In this video, we will not preach. We will not judge. We will not argue theology. We will pause. We will reflect. And above all, we will remember not the title he carried, but the life he lived. Mindfully, humbly, completely. This is not a video about the Pope. This is a story about the light one life can carry and how that light continues even after the one who held it is gone. So take a breath, settle in, and let this be a space of stillness, a mindful pause to honor not just who he was, but what he showed us we could become. The Pope who led with silence. True to the spirit of humility we saw in Part 1, Pope Francis didn't lead by commanding attention. He led by quieting the noise around him and within him. He was never the loudest voice in the room, but somehow, even in silence, he spoke volumes. His pauses held more meaning than many declarations. His stillness, more powerful than any performance. In a time when so many are shouting to be heard, he chose instead to listen, and by listening, he was truly heard. In a world obsessed with speed, headlines, and declarations, Pope Francis did something radical. He slowed down. He chose stillness. And in doing so, he reminded us of a profound truth, one often drowned out by modern life. You don't need to raise your voice to raise awareness. At refugee camps, he stood without fanfare, his silence wrapped around the broken like a prayer. At Ground Zero, his tears said more than speeches ever could. In spaces of pain, confusion, and injustice, he didn't dominate. He didn't dictate. He simply showed up present, mindful, and open. He didn't need applause. He didn't need approval. He only needed presence. And it was through that presence that healing could begin. We live in a time where we are told to brand ourselves, to perform, to be louder, sharper, faster. But what if the deepest form of leadership is the one that speaks with no agenda, only sincerity? Francis embodied that, not through charisma, but through compassion. Not through spotlight, but through surrender. And not through power, but through presence. Perhaps then, the true message of his silence wasn't to retreat from the world, but to show us how to return to it, more whole. A revolutionary in disguise. In the previous chapter, we explored how Pope Francis led not by commanding, but by being present, by embodying a kind of leadership rooted in stillness and mindful attention. Now, we take a step further into the quiet revolution he lived each day. He wasn't political, at least not in the way politics is typically understood. He didn't shout slogans, he didn't rally crowds, he didn't draw ideological lines in the sand. And yet, the path he walked was deeply radical. Pope Francis became a revolutionary not through confrontation, but through compassion. He embraced LGBTQ+ individuals, not to create controversy, but because he saw people before he saw labels. While others built barriers, he extended hands. In a world eager to divide, he chose to unite gently, humbly, without conditions. He knelt to wash the feet of Muslim immigrants, not for applause, but to remind us all that dignity transcends doctrine. He visited prisoners, touched those afflicted with leprosy, and comforted the dying not to convert, but to accompany. In an institution known for secrecy, he opened the Vatican's finances to the light. In a church scarred by scandal, he confronted abuse not with denial, but with repentance. He didn't hide from the darkness. He stepped into it, and in doing so, asked us to do the same. He met with atheists, humanists, and even those who had turned away from faith, not to change their minds, but to open his heart. Because for Pope Francis, connection was never about agreement. It was about recognition of the shared humanity that binds us all. And perhaps what was most extraordinary in his revolution was this: through it all, he never demanded the world become Catholic. He never pushed a dogma or demanded conformity. He simply extended an invitation to become more human. That was his revolution, a revolution of humility, of empathy, of radical kindness. What he taught us about compassion. Coming from a life of radical humility and revolutionary kindness, Pope Francis did not change the world with fiery sermons or thunderous speeches. He changed it with something much quieter, small, mindful gestures that opened hearts in ways doctrine never could. He didn't rely on elaborate words. Instead, he offered us a gentle hand, the kind that held no judgment. He smiled at children, not for a photo opportunity, but because he genuinely delighted in their presence. He issued apologies from the church, not to maintain image, but because it was the right thing to do. He tweeted simple truths, like reminding us that the poor are not a burden we carry, but a mirror reflecting who we are and who we've forgotten. Pope Francis reminded us in a time overwhelmed by ideology that compassion is not a belief system. It's not a doctrine to be memorized. It's not reserved for saints or scholars. Compassion is a way of seeing, a lens that softens our gaze and sharpens our understanding. It's a way of being, a way of walking through the world with arms slightly more open and hearts slightly less guarded. And it's a way of healing, not just others, but ourselves, because every time we extend grace, we dissolve a bit of the hardness that fear and ego build inside us. He reminded us that being compassionate doesn't always mean changing the world sometimes. It just means being present in a way that changes one moment for one person. In a fractured world where noise often drowns out nuance, Pope Francis quietly modeled a better way, a softer way, not of escaping the brokenness, but of moving through it with love. Pope Francis and the Art of Letting Go. Following a life that radiated compassion in the smallest of gestures, Pope Francis brought that same mindful presence to one of life's greatest transitions, his own mortality. In 2023, Pope Francis openly spoke to the world about the inevitability of death, not as a warning, not as a farewell soaked in sorrow, but as a moment of deep, sacred invitation. He asked us not to fear the final chapter, but to receive it with grace, just as we would receive a blessing. It is not the end that defines us, he said, but how we end. And even in his final days, Pope Francis was still teaching not with a pulpit or a platform, but with presence. He reminded us that dying can be an act of mindfulness, that letting go, too, can be done with love. As his body began to fade, his spirit only became more vivid. He offered no spectacle, no drama, only a calm unfolding like a leaf returning to the earth, quietly completing its journey. He didn't cling, he didn't resist. He surrendered fully, gently, purposefully. And now, we, the living, are the ones entrusted with what he left behind. Not just his quotes, shared in books or online, not just his legacy, preserved in history, but his way of seeing the world, a vision shaped by tenderness, anchored in service, and guided by humility. This is what we carry now, not a memory to enshrine, but a practice to embody. As we turn to our final chapter in this tribute, let's ask, what will we do with the light he left behind? What do we do with the light he left us? After a life of tenderness, presence, and mindful surrender, Pope Francis left us with something far more lasting than doctrine. He left us with a question. You see, the true measure of a soul is not in how loudly it was heard, but in how gently it made others feel seen. And Pope Francis did exactly that. He saw the invisible. He noticed the ones the world forgot. And somehow, simply by noticing them, he gave them back their dignity. He made the far feel near. He made the overlooked feel cherished. He made faith feel less like a fortress and more like a sanctuary, not built to keep people out, but to welcome them in. And now that he's gone, the question that remains is not, what will the church do? The question is much more personal. What will we do? Asterisk. What will you do with the tenderness he showed? What will I do with the humility he modeled? What will we as a collective, as a people, as a planet become, now that his hands can no longer reach, but his example continues to stretch across generations? Because legacy is not a statue. It's not a holiday. It's not a line in a book. Legacy is what we choose to do next. It's how we speak to the people we usually ignore. It's how we forgive when bitterness feels justified. It's how we choose softness when hardness would be easier. And so we ask again, not with pressure, but with love. What will we do with the light he left us? A moment of mindfulness together. If you've made it this far, take a moment with us not to scroll, not to decide, not even to think. Just one breath. Inhale, slow and deep. Exhale, soft and steady. This breath is not for the Pope. It's for what he woke up in you, for the kindness you remembered, for the stillness you reclaimed, for the dignity in your own being that quietly nodded along as you listened to his story. Pope Francis may be gone, but the light he carried, the kind that doesn't blind but gently warms, still lingers. And now, that light belongs to you, to carry, to share, to become. So, if his life touched you, let your life echo it. Like this video if it brought you a moment of stillness. Share it with someone who may be carrying pain quietly. Subscribe to Mindful Way Television, not for numbers, but to build a softer internet, a more mindful world. And in the comments, tell us, what did Pope Francis awaken in you? What quiet value do you now wish to live louder? Because sometimes, the holiest thing we can do is remember the light and then become it. And if this video spoke to your heart, we gently invite you to explore our next video, a continuation of this mindful journey. Each story, each breath, each step forward matters. Rest gently, Pope Francis. Your silence still speaks, and we are still listening.